I'm Logan Crawford, and right now on Spotlight, we're speaking with author Rose Clayworth. She has written a wonderful memoir, a book called Blue on Blue, Heartache in Wartime. It is a deeply personal account of her experience during and after Arabian Gulf War I. As a survivor of a marriage that went south and someone who successfully rebuilt her life, she offers a candid and powerful exploration of love, loss, and the impact of war. Now settled in New Zealand, she finds herself confronted with the memories of the past as Arabian Gulf War II unfolds, forcing her to navigate the complex emotions that arise while searching for happiness in the present. We are delighted to have Rose in the spotlight today. We thank the team at Atticus Publishing for helping us put her in the spotlight today. And we ask viewers like you to support writers like her by subscribing to our channel. Rose, thanks so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you very much, Logan. It's a pleasure to be here.
Pleasure is all mine. This is a great book. It's a personal book. It's a heartfelt book. You can tell you poured your heart and soul into it. What was it like dealing with the honesty that you needed to deal with to put your story down on paper?
Well, as I say in the front of the book, I have changed some names and locations to avoid causing harm to some of the stories I tell, because obviously life's own journey involves a lot of other people. But I wanted really to record the horror of war. And, currently people are going through this right now in the 21st century over in Ukraine. And for me, it is really enough to move me to tears that we should have to resort to killing each other over property and boundaries. I wanted to record what I had experienced and to actually put into the historical record a colleague's demise, because it broke my heart when someone you know is actually killed. It brings it to life in a horrible way. Yeah.
Tell the folks at home what your role was in the first Gulf War.
In the first Gulf War, I had been in Kuwait from 1976, so 14 years up to the 1st of August 1990. My mother suffered severely from rheumatoid arthritis. From her mid-30s, she'd been, gradually becoming a cripple. And she had enjoyed the climate in Kuwait and had come out bravely on her own, the 8-hour flight from the UK, and stayed with us, my husband and I. And my husband's family, Palestinian Christians, residing and working in Kuwait, had welcomed her. We had a lovely, happy family time. And on the 1st of August 1990, I was in my house in England because I owned the little house where my mum lived. And we were planning to go back to Kuwait on the 8th of August. We had our tickets. And on the radio, we heard that Iraq had invaded Kuwait. I called my in-laws immediately, and the phone lines were open then, and advised my brother-in-law that the Iraqi army had come down from the north along these huge highways. The infrastructure in modern Kuwait, as a result of finding oil, had made this city, New York in the desert, let's say, huge highways. They'd come down very quickly. And my brother-in-law laughed. He said, Rose, this is impossible. They're arguing about oil. There was talk of slant drilling, which is the Kuwaitis were supposedly drilling into the Rumaitha oil field in northern Iraq. But we thought this was being politically resolved, as these issues should be. However, Saddam Hussein had decided that he was going to take over Kuwait, as this was his reason. And my brother-in-law put the phone down and said, I'll check on your husband, because we lived closer to Kuwait City. In fact, our marital home was right next door to the Emir of Kuwait's private palace. It was just over a wall and close to the iconic Kuwait Towers, which the Iraqis subsequently took over as their headquarters, because the Kuwait Towers, which are in the middle book behind me, I've used them as the cover for my second book. They have a vista right over Kuwait City. I mean, Kuwait State is small, a lot of desert, and Kuwait City is small compared with Western cities. So, you know, the impact of that, of course, was that, am I okay just telling you this story?
Absolutely.
The impact of that was that I rang my husband immediately, and there was no answer in our house, which, as I say, was right under Kuwait Towers. I could see my ping pong table from Kuwait Towers observation deck. So I panicked, thinking, what's happened? Has our building been shelled? It was a building that had 4 apartments in it. I couldn't get any more information because the phone lines went down. So my mum and I had a cup of tea, although it was very early in the morning in the UK. And just to cut a long story short, I did hear after 24 hours from my husband. He was sheltering in the British Embassy with a couple of friends of ours who'd been staying with him. They were leaving Kuwait for Spain for their future home, and all their possessions were in the dock at the Kuwait port waiting for a container, and their suitcases had to be opened by the Iraqi soldiers. And there's an incident, little anecdotes in the book. The book isn't a doom and gloom story. There are little funny things that happen even in wartime. And sadly, you know, we couldn't go back to Kuwait. My husband, as a Palestinian and Christian, was able to stay in Kuwait and was able to assist British men who were sheltering, usually in their false ceilings, coming out only at night, for fear of being taken hostage, because Saddam Hussein's strategy to delay any possible military intervention to remove Iraq's army from Kuwait was to take hostages. And his guests, as he called them, were taken to Iraq proper. He called Kuwait his 19th state and was trying to take over the operation of the oil companies, and he ordered teachers to go back to work, local Kuwaitis. But the horror stories of torture and imprisonment, and I do know some of these were true, because the dean, I worked for Kuwait University, and the dean of my faculty, her brother was taken prisoner. So there were some horror stories. My own husband, I began to severely doubt his motivation. He was very money oriented, and he stayed in Kuwait quite late. I could only send messages through friends in Jordan, and I warned him that, you know, there was going to be a military intervention to remove Iraq. I think the details in my book are accurate, but me remembering now, you know, under tension of interview. I think Saddam was given till January the 15th, 1991, to remove his soldiers without any penalty. The women and children who'd been taken hostage or were held in hotels or palaces in Kuwait, they were released, often with the intervention of the Australian diplomats. I know my British friend who was caught, you know, as my husband was, on the beach, sheltering from shells, digging holes in the sand to protect themselves. She got out, and her husband was hiding in Kuwait. Ted Heath, who was a politician in Britain at the time, intervened quite cleverly, because Saddam has as all dictators have, a big ego. Ted Heath went over and negotiated the release of all hostages, even before the deadline. I think they came out before Christmas 1990. And of course, Saddam may have hoped that he'd be allowed to keep his 19th state, but in fact, the war, as threatened, the bombing began on January the 17th, 1991. So meanwhile, I had persuaded my husband to take a break. We hadn't had much time to have holidays. He was a workaholic, and I think I was too, because we hadn't had children, sadly. The reasons for that are in the books. And so we went to Australia via Brunei. I met up with old friends. He was interested in manpower recruitment. The Philippines is a great source of talent, still is. So we had a wonderful trip around Australia, punctuated on a regular basis by the argument Saddam Hussein did not invade Kuwait. America invaded Kuwait. And many people do not know or care about the Gulf Wars. I mean, the terminology of the Gulf is difficult. You've got your own Gulf in America, the Gulf of Mexico, but the Persian Gulf, as it has been traditionally called through history, is called the Arabian Gulf by those on the, looking at the map, the left-hand side, the west side, is occupied by Arab countries. And the right-hand side on the map, the east side, is occupied by Iran, the new name for Persia. So the Arabian Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War, the first one, which I have simply called Gulf War I, was the attempt by George Bush Sr. to push Saddam out of Kuwait. And he succeeded. And many books have been written by those experiencing it from the American viewpoint, from every viewpoint of people who participated or who observed that. It was a shocking, horrible time. I was lucky in April, after visiting Australia and arguing with my husband endlessly, I was invited by my dean to go back and clean up my faculty. And although cluster bombs had been dropped all over Kuwait, I completely forgot in my desire to reestablish my department, because we were working in health sciences English, and we'd created a lot of our own materials. And I was very keen to pick up papers that had been just strewn. I mean, we had almost 30 filing cabinets of the old-fashioned type, you know, the metal filing cabinets with 3 or 4 drawers. Yeah. They'd been occupied by the Iraqi forces, my department officers. I had almost 20 teachers working in health sciences English, and they'd all been forced open and the contents just thrown around. I mean, used as coasters for coffee cups. Right. There was hair in my office. It had been used as the barber's department, I think. So this in itself was a horrible experience. I got out of the Middle East, to cut a long story short, when I sensed that George Bush Jr. was going to go in and punish Saddam. Now, this second Gulf War was very controversial. I think all nations, even the Soviet Union, which had just broken down the year before, supported Gulf War I to free Kuwait. And yet Gulf War II was very controversial. In the US, you had the horrific tragedy of 9/11, 2001. And the idea that Saddam was developing weapons of mass destruction is still contested. I have the books here, Hans Blech's book, where he insists that not enough time was given to search for these in Iraq. And yet I have one book. I mentioned these in the bibliography at the back of Blue on Blue. I have an account by a scientist who had studied in the US and was summoned back from his position in a US university to prepare Saddam's weapon of mass destruction. And I have another account by people who have a much earlier account, who have verified that he invested a huge amount of money. There was even a case of him shipping parts because he was sanctioned in Gulf War I and 10 years after that. He was not allowed to make weapons of mass destruction, but he got a Sheffield company. I'm from the north of England originally. He got a Sheffield company to ship parts out, which were going to make a massive gun that he could, arm with a nuclear cap to attack Israel, which was his professed excuse for taking over Kuwait. So I got out. I was fortunate. I got a job at a university here, a major university in the North Island, and I was aging. I had already divorced my husband. Our fault had completely erupted, and we had parted. And as I took up my job in February, I came here February 2003. There had been all the controversy about should there be an attack on Iraq or not. And many of the European Union countries said, no, it's wrong. You cannot go into a country and remove a dictator, an acknowledged dictator who had gassed his own citizens, both the Marsh Arabs who lived in the south of Iraq and the Kurds who lived in the north of Iraq. He had done terrible things. And the Christian population of Iraq had been decimated because Christians had just got out. But the Ba'ath Party, which is a separate issue from being a Muslim, the Ba'ath Party that Saddam ruled was really, really vicious. Children were encouraged to say whether they had a photo or picture of Saddam Hussein in their house or not. And if they didn't, there would be a penalty. So Tony Blair from the UK, joined with George Bush Jr. in the desire to wipe out any potential weapons of mass destruction, even though Hans Blix, in charge of the UN weapons inspector team, insisted that there weren't. But I've lived 20 plus years in the desert. The desert's a huge place. I mean, if the British could camouflage weapons in the Second World War, you have to accept that there probably were. I'm on the side that there were. But nevertheless, driving to Auckland for the first time on my own to conduct a professional development session with teachers of ESOL, my heart broke to think that the citizens of Baghdad were now being bombed. And the scary thing was, war has become something we see now. And it seems to be treated sometimes by the media. And I'm sorry, Logan.
No, I agree. It's treated cavalierly, as if
right.
it's not a huge endeavor. People's lives are lost. People's lives are changed. Countries are ruined. The trajectory of history has changed. It's awful.
It is. So I decided, it did bring back what had happened to me, which I'd never written about because I had a busy professional life. And I thought a way to try and share this is to go through what's happening, but locate it in my own story. We're all victims, if you like, of where we are born and how we are educated and brought up. I mean, if we never have any chances, if you're brought up poor, as I was, and with divorced parents, as I was, you may want to just shelter in your known little corner of the world. But I didn't. I wanted to get out. I wanted to really change my birthright, if you like, and make something, not of myself, but of what life has to offer. And I could just think of my colleague, Margaret Hassan, whom I'd met in Baghdad. I'd gone to Baghdad during the Iran-Iraq war, which lasted almost a decade. My husband had threatened not to let me come back to the house, although my mother was in Kuwait at the time. My mother told me this, of course, he did when I got back, because I was going into a country that was still at war. But Margaret needed a qualification, and I was an assessor, and I could give it to her. And as a woman, it had to be a woman assessing a woman. Iraq had been very free. We had Iraqi neighbors in Kuwait, and they had had good education before Saddam and the Ba'ath Party came in.
Amazing.
The country, I feel huge sympathy for Iraq, for Iraqis, for Kuwait, for Kuwaitis, for my colleague who was kidnapped and killed after the place where we were working had closed, and she worked for the organization, a charity organization helping women and children. And, you know, I don't really mind how few people read it, but I have got Margaret's legacy in a way. She was a great teacher. She was a great human being, and she is no longer. And I'm extremely sad about that.
Yeah. Well, it's a painful part of history, the problems that happened in the Gulf region with two wars, back-to-back presidents who were father and son.
Yes.
It took the toll on the people of the region. It took the toll on Americans, people in the UK, all around the globe. And your book is a powerful reminder of the cost of war. The name of the book is Blue on Blue, Heartache in Wartime. It is written by Rose Clayworth. It is highly recommended. Rose, thank you so much for joining us here today on Spotlight.
Thank you very much, Logan. I appreciate the chance to express why I wrote the book.
Well, I appreciate your candor and I appreciate your hard work on this book. And to the folks at home, I'm Logan Crawford, thanking you for your time this time. Until next time on Spotlight.